We are just having some more few people joining, so okay. Nicole is in the woods today. Okay, so I think everybody is now here and maybe people will be connecting later. Okay, so let's start. Like we already have like 10:05, so I guess it's okay to start. So good morning, afternoon, good night. I don't know where are you connecting from. Welcome to the series of the doctoral program webinars. I'm Maria Teresa Garrido. I'm the coordinator of the doctoral program, and I'm very glad to see some of our doctoral students, candidates, and others interested in this topic. So I will introduce the Amique. He will be the moderator of this webinar, and then he will introduce Felipe. Thank you for connecting and thank you for joining to this webinar.
Thank you. So yeah, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or wherever you are. My name is Tiamikem Kantama, and I would like to welcome you all to this webinar, which is part of a series of webinars organized for and by University for Peace, UPeace doctoral students in conjunction with the UPeace Doctoral Committee. One of the intentions of these webinars is to provide a platform for the students to share their research experience thus far, and particularly in light with the COVID-19 pandemic. So before we proceed, just one housekeeping item. Please make sure that your microphones are off, especially when the speaker makes his presentation. And my job today as a moderator is very simple. So firstly, I will introduce our presenter, Felipe Zalamea Coroprese. I hope I said it right. And he's going to talk about community-based tourism as a local development strategy in rural Latin America. And the second portion will involve coordinating the Q&A session. So you have an opportunity to ask questions. But as the presentation unfolds, please feel free to write in the chat box and I'll bring the questions that you have to Felipe's attention. So just to introduce our speaker, Felipe is an economist from Sorbonne University, Paris, France. And after 1 year of ground research on social innovation and traveling across South America in 2011, he moved to London, where he founded Sumac Sustainable Travel in 2012. Sumac Sustainable Travel is a social enterprise specialized in community-based tourism and sustainable tourism in Latin America. He has visited and promoted hundreds of local sustainable tourism projects. And in 2015, Sumac Travel moved its operations to Costa Rica. And in 2017, it became a sustainable tourism platform. Occasionally, Felipe works as a consultant in tourism and local development projects for clients such as the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, Biofin, Impact Hub, and many other local NGOs. His doctoral research at the University for Peace focuses on finance, community-based tourism, and entrepreneurship in rural Costa Rica. So without further ado, let me pass the platform to Felipe. Thank you. See you on the other side.
Thank you, Tia and Maria Teresa. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to see you're here for this presentation. Can you see the screen? Yeah, perfect.
Yes.
So as Tia was mentioning, the presentation is about community-based tourism as a local development strategy in rural Latin America. And the presentation is divided in 3 sections. First, I'm going to present the definitions of and approaches to community-based tourism in the literature. So I'm coming from an academic perspective, but I'm gonna also share some views from my experience on the ground, in particular working directly with community-based tourism initiatives in Latin America. Then I will present the list of positive impacts and contributions to sustainability that CBT has mainly at local level. These two first sections focus on the rural developing world. For the last section, I focus on Latin America, and I'm going to be sharing some of the challenges and solutions to CBT implementation, specifically in the rural areas. So let's start with definition. I reviewed all of the literature available on community-based tourism, also included reports and other documents from NGOs, support organizations, and governments. And the conclusion was that there is not a consensus. There are many different definitions, and this is something that wouldn't happen with sustainable tourism or ecotourism or regenerative tourism. These concepts have their own formal definition, or at least few definitions. With community-based tourism, what we have, it's a lot of definitions. So after reviewing all of them, I divided them into 3 categories. The first category is what I called soft CBT, and it depends on the essential feature or features that this definition has in order to consider a project or our initiative CBT. Soft CBT are those definitions where local community involvement is enough to consider a project CBT. I'm giving a couple of examples. I'm gonna just read one of them from the World Wildlife Fund, which defines CBT as a form of ecotourism where the local community has substantial control over and involvement in its development and management, and a major proportion of the benefits remain within the community. So it's very simple, straightforward. WWF is one of the biggest supporters worldwide to CBT initiatives. And then we move to the next category, that is rigorous CBT. This is when we have local community involvement and sustainability aspects within the definition. Again, here are a couple of examples. I'm going to read the first one. CBT development would seek to strengthen institutions designed to enhance local participation and promote the economic, social, and cultural well-being of the popular majority. It would also seek to strike a balanced and harmonious approach to development that would stress considerations such as the compatibility of various forms of development with other components of the local economy, the quality of development, both culturally and environmentally, and the divergent needs, interests, and potentials of the community and its inhabitants. So what we see here is increased complexity. We have local community involvement, but we also have sustainability aspects that mostly relate to poverty alleviation, community development, and environmental conservation. These types of definitions are preferred by scholars, by the academia, because in general, their approach is more from a sustainability perspective and less from a community participation perspective. Finally, we have the entrepreneurial definitions of community-based tourism. It's where we have local community involvement, sustainability aspects, but we also have enterprise considerations. In particular, we include customers or tourists within these definitions. Community-based tourism has a lot of value propositions to offer to tourists. The majority of definitions don't take into account customers when they define community-based tourism. A couple of examples. I'm going to read the first one. CBT is tourism that takes environmental, social, and cultural sustainability into account. It is managed and owned by the community for the community with the purpose of enabling visitors to increase their awareness and learn about community and local ways of life. Again, it's simple. It includes the participation, involvement from local community, but it mentions explicitly tourists. I reviewed more than 30 definitions of community-based tourism, and about half of these definitions are soft definitions. So here we start seeing a first problem with the approach from both academia and practitioners to community-based tourism. They tend to consider local community involvement as enough to define as an initiative or a project as CBT. This leads us directly to a huge problem that especially was important in the 80s and the 90s, which is the pseudo CBT. It is local projects or initiatives that are completely funded, set up, and managed by outsider organizations. A typical example would be a big NGO coming to a poor rural community and setting up this tourism project, pretending that it's CBT just because the local community is somehow taking part into the initiative. Sometimes they're the product, the tourism product, which can lead to other problems. But we have these situations where local communities are not the owners, they are not the managers, and they have no decision power. Yet, these outsider organizations present these initiatives as community-based tourism, so pseudo-CBT. Next, we have two different and well-defined approaches to CBT development, and this comes from the review of the literature as well. On the one hand, we have the top-down CBT. It's generally when an organization or a few organizations are funding the initiative. Sometimes they also manage the initiative with participation, with genuine participation from the local communities involved. On the other hand, we have the bottom-up CBT initiatives where the local communities are the owners, the managers, the leaders, empowered groups of people that work with a whole array of support organizations to set up and grow their tourism ventures. Lastly, in terms of CBT development, it is very important to keep in mind that CBT is and should always remain a complementary source of income for the local communities involved. We don't want local communities to give up their main activity, their culture, their lifestyle. They don't need to become full-time tourism workers or entrepreneurs. They just use tourism to supplement their main source or their main sources of income, keeping the volumes of tourism low. And as a result, they have no dependency. They don't rely on tourism, which is very important in situations where external shocks, such as a pandemic, hit. So today, the tourism industry is going through a difficult time because of the pandemic, but we know that community-based tourism initiatives and the rural communities involved are mainly okay because they don't rely entirely on tourism for their survival or for their main income. So, and for my research, based on also my experience on the ground as an entrepreneur, I went for entrepreneurial definitions of CBT. I think to analyze the different aspects related to CBT development, it's better to use these entrepreneurial definitions. Now we move to the positive impacts of CBT. Again, this is the developing world. What you see on the right column are the references. So there are many scholars that have already worked on these topics, and you can go into very deep details on how community-based tourism has positive impacts, especially at local level. I have divided those impacts in 4 dimensions. The first dimension would be the economic one. So CBT can generate additional income, create decent jobs, promote the creation of community funds, contribute to local development, enhance economic linkages, and enable income redistribution. What we see here are some of the main motivations for local communities to start working with tourism. If you were approaching CBT from a sustainability perspective, you might think that conservation or biodiversity are the main motivations for rural communities. But what we see is that rural communities start working with tourism because they want this additional source of income, because they want to create decent jobs within the community. Next dimension is the environmental dimension. CBT can contribute to conservation efforts, land protection, and biodiversity preservation. CBT can also support effective climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies at local level. Rather than seeing nature as a source of raw materials or commodities, many rural communities start seeing the value of nature as conserved or preserved nature. Let me say that again. When you see a forest or a protected area, you might think that from an economic perspective, it makes more sense just to cut the trees and sell it, or clear the land to grow some crops. Thanks to tourism, many rural communities change that mindset, and they see a value of preserving that forest as it is, because then they can have tourists that come and visit that forest or that protected area and pay for the services, for the activities that they are acquiring. The next dimension is the social dimension, where we see that CBT can generate capacity building while increasing access to public services and civil rights, and it can also promote ethical tourism and prevent migrations from the rural areas into big cities. In particular, for young people, it's very important to have access to jobs that are, let's say, interesting within their community. So tourism opens a whole world of potentiality for young people, so they don't have to migrate into the cities to find a job that fits with their studies, their capacities, or what they want to do. The final dimension is the cultural dimension, where CBT can help to recuperate the cultural identity of local communities and to preserve ancestral traditions, especially amongst indigenous people and other minorities. And CBT can also promote gender equality and improve the self-esteem levels of local communities in rural areas or shantytowns. Gender, from a gender perspective, it's very important. We've seen across the literature and across the developing world a significant number of women-led CBT initiatives. In rural context, where maybe you don't have, as a woman, access to the job market because there are no jobs for women in those particular areas, tourism can be a solution. The opportunity for women to develop new skills, to work in positions of management or similar, where they can be empowered or more independent. Summarizing CBT's contributions to sustainability, there is a consensus within the literature to consider CBT as a pillar of the sustainable tourism movement. We've seen that it can generate important, significant, positive outcomes at local level, but it's also a smarter way of doing tourism, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens when the tourism industry starts to recover, because we're going to be forced to move into a model that is low volume, less mass tourism, less extractivist, less commodified. We're going to probably be moving towards an industry that values more local knowledge, environmental conservation, and responsible use of natural resources. Things that community-based tourism initiatives have been doing for decades now. CBT also empowers local communities to create and manage their own ventures, in particular when the approach to CBT development is bottom-up. This can be very effective. Rural communities are facing a significant problem. We see the pandemic, but before the pandemic, they were also facing structural problems that might be difficult to solve without tourism, such as infrastructure, capacity building, access to public services such as education and health. So community-based tourism brings all these benefits into the community, not only to the people that are leading the tourism venture, but also to the community as a whole. CBT is also a practical, sustainable livelihood strategy. Again, because it is a complementary source of income, what happens is that rural communities can have different economic activities, and tourism can come to reinforce this capacity that communities have to be resilient, to fulfill their needs, create those economic linkages that at the end will result in a more dynamic local economy with all the environmental and cultural results that I mentioned before. And it works very well as a mitigation and adaptation strategy to climate change. And we see this especially with agriculture. If you're familiar with situations in rural areas, you know that things are becoming harder and harder for farmers. Crops, productivity, and natural disasters, the growth of monocultures are playing a key role in the development of those rural areas. And this is negatively affecting those farmers. So tourism can come and become this tool that communities can use to compensate for that loss that they're suffering in the agricultural sector. Okay, from here, I'm gonna be talking specifically about Latin American community-based tourism. This is my area of expertise. It's where my research is focusing on. In the challenges to implementation, there are many. Community-based tourism is very complex. There are many variables that you need to take into account. There's no secret formula to get it right. It depends a lot on the context, and from one country to another, you can have big differences in terms of implementation and success. So I have taken a few of these challenges to just give you a better idea at a continental level, the most important ones, the barriers that rural communities are facing when they work with CBT. First, goals such as sustainability, community development, and positive impact can only be achieved when CBT functions as a viable business activity. And if you are not familiar with CBT, this could be like obvious, but it's not for rural communities and it's not for support organizations, especially when you approach CBT from a sustainability or community development or environmentalist perspective. When you set up the initiative for the project, hopefully following a bottom-up approach where local communities are the leaders, many times the main goals are these sustainability aspects. And we've seen in the literature and on the ground that the only way these goals can be achieved is if the CBT initiative operates as a business, because tourism ventures need to be profitable or at least to break even in order to generate all those positive impacts that I mentioned before. If you only focus on the sustainability aspects, most likely after a few years, the project or initiative will disappear or will stop operating. Next challenge, there is a risk when local communities start working with tourism that they fall into a dependency on external funding or support. This is particularly relevant for top-down initiatives where there is one or a few major donors that have funding for a limited period, let's say 2, 3, or 5 years. And during that period, if there is no capacity building, if there is no ownership from the local communities, most likely when the funding is over, the project won't be able to keep operating or working as it should. In general, these communities, the committee members, are not qualified or trained to take on roles that require upper skills such as management or marketing. So it's a slow process. You cannot start a tourism business in a rural context in the developing world and expect the community members to be able to do marketing or management or go to a business meeting or business tourism fair the first year. You need to build up those capacities, again, from an entrepreneurial perspective. Next, we have the barriers to create successful market linkages and commercialization strategies. Here, I think that all the support organizations and governments have some responsibility because they are not tourism experts. So if you see the list of organizations that support CBT, be it with funding or with training or with promotion, in general, they don't know the industry. They don't have enough information to define or to understand who are the customers, how to create a product that is market ready, a product that fits with the market. So what we see at continental level is a lot of community-based tourism initiatives who have everything, the infrastructure, the portfolio of activities, they have training on customer service, they have training on guiding. Sometimes they even own a car to offer transportation services, but they don't have customers because they haven't created those market linkages with other tourism businesses or effective commercialization strategies to guarantee that there is a flow of tourists coming into their communities. And lastly, for top-down CBT initiatives, local communities are not empowered and they may not feel ownership of the initiative. And this leads directly to fatigue, to lack of motivation when communities have to take over or to become self-sufficient or independent. So this can also lead to failures in CBT initiatives. This table summarizes the different approaches to CBT development with regards to funding, governance, and long-term survival rate. Again, based mainly on the literature review. Pseudo CBT, we have projects that are entirely funded by outsiders where local communities have no control whatsoever. So the long-term survival rates are low. As soon as the funding for the project finishes, then the CBT initiative is over. Top-down, for the funding, we have a combination of own resources from the local communities and grants and donations from one or a few donors, most of the time with strings attached. The project has to fulfill the goals and requirements of the donor, not the local community. And in terms of governance, local communities may have some room for control or management, but in general, the strategy and the implementation are controlled by the donor. The long-term survival rate of these initiatives is medium, and largely it depends on the capacity from local communities to take over when the funding is over. When the donor is done with its project and it's time for them to be on their own and to achieve self-sufficiency. If they have enough capacity to do it, then they will survive. If not, they will have to close the tourism venture. And lastly, bottom-up CBT. It's a combination of own resources from the local communities and grants and donations in small amounts, usually between 10,000 and 50,000 US dollars, from different donors with no strings attached. So local communities have full independence when managing, setting up, and growing their tourism ventures. This results in high long-term survival rates. I'm going to give you an example of a top-down initiative down here in Costa Rica. Caminos de Osa received funding from $2 million from the University of Stanford and Fundación Cruza, which is the cooperation agency between the US and Costa Rica. This project was from 2014 and 2019. The initiative was integrated by 40 tourism entrepreneurs from 6 rural communities in the Osa Peninsula. The Osa Peninsula is a destination hugely important in terms of biodiversity, not only for Costa Rica, but for the whole continent. And the implementation and management for this initiative were outsourced to a private consultancy firm from San Jose, from the capital city. This consultancy firm had some experience with tourism, but no experience whatsoever with community-based tourism. Funding was over last year, and currently the local association, which is the structure that they created within the initiative to hand control over to the local communities, is currently transitioning. This association is currently transitioning from that top-down approach into a bottom-up approach. In other words, they're on their own, and it was so difficult before the pandemic. You can imagine how difficult this transition is going to be during a pandemic. And to give you some perspective, between 1992 and 2015, the UNDP donated 3.6 million US dollars to 97 bottom-up CBT initiatives in Costa Rica. This doesn't mean that all the 97 initiatives are a success. This doesn't mean that they are all operating or working within the industry, like successfully linked with other tourism businesses or having the levels of customers that they want. This could be a separate conversation, how to measure the success rate for a group of CBT initiatives in a particular country. But this is an indicator, or this could lead us to conclude that next time someone has $2 million to donate to support community-based tourism, it might make more sense to select 10 to 15 bottom-up CBT initiatives and give the money in smaller amounts. With those $2 million, relatively very few community members were benefited. We don't know what's going to happen in the long term. If we had taken the bottom-up approach, way more community members would have benefited. Most likely in the long term, they will be there. And to finish, and as a way of conclusion as well, and we can open for questions, solutions to implementation, again, for rural Latin America. Bottom-up CBT is more effective. So every time we start or we support a CBT initiative, we should do it from a bottom-up approach. The communities have to be the leaders, the owners, the managers of the initiative. We also need to shift towards an entrepreneurial approach. Obviously, sustainability aspects are important, and they might be the main reason why we support CBT. If I am an environmentalist NGO or I am the government, probably my main motivations to support CBT are conservation or community development. But as I mentioned before, for this to be successful in the long term, it has to be seen as a business, as a commercial activity. So the suggestion is that we stop talking about community-based tourism initiatives or enterprises, and we start talking about community-based tourism enterprises. They have an associative model, and in fact, in Latin America, most CBT initiatives are associations or cooperatives. This means that there is some democracy and transparency in the management and in the governance of the initiatives. But they need to operate as tourism business with proper financials, with proper bookkeeping, with a strong commercial strategy that keeps customers into account. If we want to take a step further, we could say that these are social enterprises. It's a big movement, a global movement. We've seen the B Corps that are increasing their visibility. So rather than seeing as a humanitarian or development projects, we could see these initiatives as social enterprises or B Corps. Umbrella organizations can play a key role in supporting CBT initiatives and rural communities. They can act as a channel of external support, be it funding or training or promotion. They can also be tour operators, which is particularly important for rural communities that don't have the means or the conditions to do marketing directly to customers or to have commercial partnerships with other tourism businesses within the industry. For instance, because they live in remote areas with no internet or electricity, because they don't speak English or foreign languages, or because they don't have the capacity to do social media or have a website or implement a more aggressive marketing strategy. And also, umbrella organizations can work as an advocacy group. They can represent sector. They can have dialogues with governments and multilateral organizations to communicate what these individual CBT initiatives need, what is needed to support them and to more effectively promote community-based tourism as a tourism product. Then we have the network of supporters, and again, following the bottom-up approach, it's essential that we don't rely on one or two big supporters. So as a rural community, what you should have is a whole network, hopefully that they know each other and work together and coordinate the efforts, so they can lead, the local communities can lead the initiative and have specific support from those different organizations in an effective way. And finally, public policy. which is something where we are behind as a continent. There are important initiatives in some countries where governments have already recognized this power that community-based tourism has to generate positive impact in a cost-effective way. So those countries are already creating legislation or whole public policies to support CBT and rural communities. That we need to do more. Ideally, every country should have its own public policy agenda to effectively support CBT, not because they want to reduce poverty or do environmental conservation, but because they see community-based tourism as a strategy for local development, as a catalyzer for positive impact. And with this, I finish. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm gonna take some questions now.
Thank you very much, Felipe, for this amazing presentation. The first question that I have here, it comes from Pratush, and he's asking if there are more examples of sustainable tourism other than the CBT.
Yes, there are many. Actually, CBT is a very small, comparatively, sector within the tourism industry. Now, regenerative tourism is trending, and I think it's going to be very important in the short term, especially in a post-pandemic scenario. Sustainable tourism is like an umbrella term for many specific types of tourism. Community-based tourism is one of them. The key in that aspect is that we recognize community-based tourism as a leader in terms of sustainability and positive impact.
Thank you. And Nicole made a comment that she agrees with the business aspect, and that there is a need to also support the education aspect with training in finance and help them in empowering in these small communities. So she's an educationer, so educationist. I'm sure she is interested in that aspect.
Yeah,
yes.
I wanted to comment on that because I think we in the university here, we do a lot of community-based tourism. We're out in the communities and, you know, making sure, you know, trying to empower the local communities to be able to support and to find entrepreneurial ways, whether it's with, you know, with cheeses or with jams or things like that, more agriculturally based. But there's also the need for basic training, basic financing. You know, how do you know how much to charge for, you know, a pan casera, or what are these types of things, and being able to budget and all that. So that's also something that's really important as well to consider with this.
Yeah, I fully agree, and this is where umbrella organizations and public institutions have a key role to play, because it is available. Like if you want to set up a tourism venture, you will have free training on those different aspects: bookkeeping, accountancy, finance, product development. But there is no a single like a logic structure to it. And local communities, they don't know the industry. Most of the time, they don't even have experience with businesses or as entrepreneurs. So for them, it's very difficult to identify the type of training that they need. Luckily, there are networks that are operating at national, regional, and continental level that are tackling this problem, that are able to talk to the government and say, so this is the type of training, this is the training package that local communities need.
Thank you. And if anybody wants to say something, you can also raise your hand here using that Zoom functionality. So yeah, I see Mick has he would like to ask a question related with the methodology. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Just have to say thank you, Felipe. Nice to see you again. Last week it was Candido, and this week it's Felipe. It's nice to see you. It's great to know batch. I just struggling to finish my proposal, and I definitely want to follow your past. Congratulations. Because since I'm working on the proposal, I just want to ask methodological things. I think you presented working definitions, very good. And then I understand your theoretical approach is it's an entrepreneurial definition of CBT. And then you mentioned that the Latin America, but I looked at you're doing case studies. You have done case studies, and maybe 4. I saw that your slide and for Costa Rica. I don't really know. You can generalize it. It's Latin America, but maybe you did much more. And then case studies. I just want to know how you did it, because if you have to get all the conclusions you presented, like challenges and then policy recommendations, I think you did the very thorough case studies already. I just want to know how you did it, because I'm also going to do a single case study, but based on the document analysis solely, maybe supplemented by interview, but main method is document analysis. So I don't know how you did it, more like interviews or the field visit, and they just really want to know how you came up with all the conclusions so far. It's interesting conclusion, but I just want to see the gap between your methodology, which I don't get it, and then your conclusions. Thank you.
So the topic of my research is access to finance for community-based tourism enterprises in Costa Rica. For that, I'm doing a multiple case study where I mapped all the CBT initiatives that were active last year. And then through a selection process, I chose 6 CBT initiatives, CBT enterprises, that I'm visiting one by one to collect data, particularly on access to finance, because there is a gap in the literature. We've seen many aspects that are important to community-based tourism, but academics or scholars are not giving enough attention to the finance aspect. Now, that's for my research. What I presented today is based on the literature review that I did for my research, which is in progress, and I should finish in 1 year if everything goes well. This literature review started with sustainable tourism at global level. Then it focuses on community-based tourism in developing countries, and then community-based tourism in rural Latin America. So the presentation today was based mostly on the literature review, not on the field work that I'm still doing for my PhD.
Okay, thank you so much. I misunderstood it. Now it's now clear, because I'm also doing a literature review and the methodology development at the same time. So it's more like you're starting from global to more regional, yes. and then more like regional level, and also thematic approach, economic, social, and then also environmental, plus the sectoral approach like finance and then marketing and others. And you decided to focus on finance because there was a huge gap. Okay, now I clear. It's very good, very good. Thank you. And also conclusion challenges come from so far from your literature review, correct?
Correct.
Good. It's a good way. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe related to that, you at what stage are you in your research? Maybe that will also highlight where you are.
Firstly, sorry, it's just I just was live to join you our Zoom meetings because of the internet connection of in Myanmar. I'm from Asia, so yeah. So I just want to ask one. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I just confused you. You don't hear me. Okay, so I really appreciate what you presenting. So it's very clear, and I understood a little bit. And then I just want to get one suggestion from you, you or like now I'm doing the research about the due to COVID-19 situation in Myanmar is a lot of things are happening about like the most like domestic violence, like kind of is especially in just I'm doing this research, but very difficult to the uh, traveling to the different areas. So sometimes it's a little problem. I just want to know like a different methodology. How did you use the research for if we have some difficulty to reach there to able to get a to get a maybe data collection or something. So on this case, how did you use to? I'm sorry that it will be not connected with you. So
Okay. Yeah, so I'm gonna answer Tia's question as well with your question. When the pandemic hit, I was in the process of collecting data, and obviously we couldn't travel, and especially because those communities are isolated, so it would be too risky to go there and maybe bring them the virus. So I had a delay of about 4 to 5 months. I have to visit 7 communities. At that moment, I had visited only 2. Then I stopped for 4 to 5 months, and recently I started to collect data again. And things, luckily, in Costa Rica are not as bad as other countries, and rural communities started to open up because they are tourism businesses, so they want to have tourists, not a huge volume, but yeah, they're open and they're operating with all the protocols from the Ministry of Health and social distancing. So at the moment, I have visited 5 communities. I have 2 more visits to do. Hopefully, I'm gonna finish data collection by the end of the year, and then I'm gonna write the thesis with all the results in 2021.
Thank you very much. Our last question, or last but one, if there will be space, because I think we have about 4 minutes to go. But the question comes from Casey, and he says, in Canada, it is difficult to find funding support with no strings attached. We need to find funders with strings that align with community goals. Is this a similar situation in other countries? And specifically, I guess we can say here in Latin America or Costa Rica.
Yeah, so this is one of the motivations to focus on finance, because what I've seen as a researcher and as an entrepreneur is that most times donors have their own agendas, and these many different definitions of CBT are linked to these agendas because you define CBT as you want. If there is no consensus or a formal definition for CBT, you use a definition that fits the purpose of your programs, your what you want to achieve from this. It's very difficult at global level to find donors that understand this and that are able to provide funding with no strings attached. And it's normal. It's how the development aid or cooperation to development works. Each institution, organization is there for a reason, and it's not necessarily what is best or easier for rural communities. What I want to do with my research, specifically on Costa Rica, is to explore ways where rural communities don't rely on this external financial support, but they can work with their own resources or access other mechanisms of finance that are more flexible for them. Probably it's not going to be non-refundable finance. Could be talking about microcredit, loans from development banks, which should have low interest rates and low requirements to access. And it also will lead into a situation where rural communities need to see their initiative as a business. Because if you have a loan to repay, even if it's in favorable conditions, you're going to be more worried about generating income and making sure you can pay it back. It's too early to tell you more about this, but that's one of the goals of my research. And another quick note is that impact investment across the world is also trending. I mentioned that these initiatives could be considered social enterprises. So there is a concrete possibility that impact investment mechanisms will reach community-based tourism at some point.
All right, thank you everyone for your participation. This was an excellent presentation, and your questions were really helpful in enriching the conversation itself, because this series are also a conversation. It's not one way. It's a horizontal way of everyone to be able to chip in and bring in their contributions. So one thing I just have to mention before we finish is that these presentations are being recorded, just to let you know, and you can go check the recordings from the previous webinars. They have been uploaded on YouTube. And the first one was on development cooperation during and after COVID-19 by Pratush. And then the second one was contextualization, peace, education, lessons learned during a pandemic, during the pandemic by Candido. So I've put them all in the chat box there. Feel free to go and watch them at your leisure time. So thank you very much. And the next one, I believe, is Pratush, do you know? When is the next one? Sorry, I forgot.
I'll have to check. I don't remember.
Okay. Yeah, information will be sent about the next one. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tia. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.